Good evening. My name is Jay Carpenter. I'm founder of Desert Blockchain. And this evening, it is our monthly session. We have these sessions on the fourth Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. Arizona time. We cover a variety of topics. And tonight, we're going to be talking about peace, conflict, and Web3. So, excuse me, for those of you that might not be familiar with the format for Desert Blockchain monthly sessions. This will last about an hour, and I have a presentation for this evening to talk about a few points that we'll go over, and then we'll kind of open it up for conversations. There are some folks that are watching on the live stream on YouTube, and we invite them to type their questions and comments over in the right-hand chat section, which I'm monitoring, and basically let us know what topics you'd like to pursue. So, Charles, thank you for joining us tonight. Is there anything you would like to cover before we get started?
No, thanks. Thanks, Jay. Good to see you.
Good to see you. All right. One thing I would like to say about Desert Blockchain is we are completely community supported. We invite you to become a Desert Blockchain citizen via Patreon, and there are links throughout our material to guide you to do that. So for that, you get early access to the presentations. You also get Zoom sessions, and we have sessions on Saturdays here at this facility that you see behind me, which is called Desert Blockchain Camp at about 27th Avenue in Camelback in Phoenix, Arizona. And we cover a variety of items there, and we work on some pretty cool projects. So let me go ahead and get started with the screen share and tell you a little bit about what sparked this conversation tonight. So hopefully you can see this. This is the introductory slide that is looking at a few fundamental elements that we're going to be exploring tonight. And I'd like to emphasize that all of these items are, let's consider that they're neither good nor bad nor anything, they're just different, okay? So on the left-hand side, we have a depiction of some elephants, circus elephants, moving basically tail to trunk, with a fellow sitting on top of the lead elephant, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more depth. But that sort of represents a centralized construct, and the centralized constructs are pretty much what human beings have been used to for almost forever. And then on the other side, on the right side, is the decentralized representation of a swarm of bees, which we'll talk about in a little more depth here in a moment. But bees generally swarm and cover a certain area, and it's hard to pinpoint any one particular bee. And we'll talk about some of the dimensions this analogy has to blockchain and decentralization and Web3. And then in the middle is an artistic representation of peace, basically, that was done by an artist that is of Russian descent. And it was done in the context of the Ukrainian conflict that's underway as we speak. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between power, force, and possibility. So hopefully that gives everyone an idea of what we're talking about, what we're going to be talking about tonight. I do invite you, if you're not a member of Desert Blockchain, to go on Meetup and join. It's free to become a member on Meetup, and that's the best way to stay in touch with all the different topics and the different events and things that we have going on in the Desert Blockchain community. So here's the general topics this evening. We're going to talk a little bit about the comparison and contrast between centralized and decentralized constructs and analogies. We're going to talk a little bit about history. We'll talk a little bit about conflicts, then peace, then Web3, and then have a little bit of a summary, conclusion, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions and so forth. So again, I invite the folks on YouTube live stream to type any comments you might have in the chat on the right. Now, a few of the things that I'd like to talk about just at kind of the 100,000 foot level is operating as human beings in a context of objects versus relationships. And what do I mean by that? I mean that as human beings, at least Jay Carpenter as a human being, I tend to, my default context in dealing with other people is often to treat them as objects. So, you know, I might be driving down the street and somebody raises a little fear in me by getting a little too close, at least in my opinion, or they're going too fast, or I feel threatened in some way. My tendency is to treat those people as objects. I don't really think of them as another human being with a family, with relationships and so forth. My only relationship is, hey, you've cut me off and you gave me a little bit of a scare, and you know, you're an object, you're a nuisance. And that compares and contrasts to a different way to relate to one another, which is via relationships. So on this particular Zoom session this evening, we're all tuned in and we're all kind of talking about a particular topic. And towards the end, we're going to be talking, we'll open it up for conversations and so forth. But there will be sort of a relationship, sort of a give and take between us relating to our different views, our different ideas of the world, our different worldviews, and so forth. So as we go through this material, I invite you to keep those two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum of the context of being with other people in mind, and kind of see how it fits in the realm of centralization and decentralization. And hopefully that'll open up some new areas for us to explore. Then we're going to talk about, we're going to be looking at this term blockchain, which is decentralization, cryptographic constructs. And we're going to look at how that might be playing into military realms, particularly in the Ukrainian conflict. Then I will highlight a talk that was done by a Pulitzer Prize winning author by the name of Thomas E. Ricks. And this was presented at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University, I think in 2016. And he talks about why I'm afraid we'll lose our next big war. And I think he brings up some excellent points that are particularly relevant to this decentralized space and the space and the context of looking at peace, conflict, and centralization versus decentralization. We'll look a little bit at the Ukrainian use of blockchain and how blockchain and decentralized distributed ledgers play into how they're currently coping with their lives and finances and information and communications and cybersecurity threats and things like that. We'll also take a quick look at Estonia, which is north of the Ukraine, but also right along the Russian border, and a little bit about what they have done in this decentralization realm. And then the last thing I'd like to kind of keep in mind as we talk about these, or I ask you to keep in mind as we talk about these different constructs, is the difference between force and power. And I'll just kind of quickly give you my take on both of these items, because it's kind of easy to collapse force and power together. But when you think about it, they're really quite different experiences. And for me, force is generally a feeling where I don't have many, if any, choices. I'm usually experiencing fear, and my worldview just kind of gets constrained into sort of like a tunnel vision. Power, on the other hand, is often accompanied, at least for me, with a feeling of inspiration. And instead of a tunnel view of the world, I have a rather expansive view of the world. And my inclination is to hopefully share that power with other people that I'm dealing with and interacting with, so that we all experience a feeling of power and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the realms of centralized constructs and decentralized constructs. So those are kind of general areas just to hopefully keep in the back of our minds as we're going through some of this material. So let's take a look at some analogies here. So again, here is a line of circus elephants, let's say, that are all in a line, that are tied together, trunk to tail. And you'll notice there's a fellow that's riding on the lead elephant and supposedly in control of these massive creatures that are moving along in a line. And let's assume they're moving for some sort of purpose. They're able to carry some sort of good or something valuable on the backs of the elephants, and they're moving it from point A to point B. Now, how does that fellow on the lead elephant basically stay in control? You know, what's to prevent that lead elephant from dropping its head and throwing this fellow off the back of the elephant and basically doing harm to that fellow? Well, the fellow uses an interesting technique of this stick, and I can't remember the name of the stick, but you see how it's got a kind of a sharp little barb on the end? That, let's call it elephant trainer, uses that sharp barb to give the elephant just a little bit of a pain or discomfort in certain key places. And voila, that does the trick to basically control these massive creatures. And I ask you to consider that this is, analogies are not perfect, but think of many of the centralized constructs that we deal with, especially in the realm of conflict, that operate on a similar type of, presenting us with a small fear that turns into a greater fear that basically leads us to comply with doing certain things that not necessarily are associated with a feeling of inspiration and choice. So how does that compare to this? Well, here we have a swarm of bees, and bees cover a vast amount of area. Bees are in the business of making honey, and they're out interacting with vegetation, and they're actually part of the process of expanding that vegetation and helping the plants and the whole ecosystem sort of flourish. And then they return to their hives, and their task is to turn that pollen and so forth into honey, which is sort of like a good that keeps them alive and sustains the hive. Well, that, in my view, is much more akin to the decentralized realm that has emerged over the last 14 years or so in the blockchain realm, and what's happening on a global scale, where we're all starting to interact with one another in a way that's more collaborative, basically. Now, keep in mind that each of these bees also carries a stinger, and there is, at least while I'm hiking in Arizona, the bees are basically the thing that I fear the most while I'm on a hike, because of their ability to gather together and basically attack myself or other things that basically disturb the nature of their day-to-day or moment-to-moment activities. So how does a beekeeper basically manage bees? Well, they do it with honey, and they do it with these hives and so forth, and they're able to attract the bees to this honey and gather up the bees and move them from crop to crop and basically help the farmers and so forth pollinate and propagate their crops. So I think as you look at this, this is kind of an interesting model to view centralized constructs and decentralized constructs. And again, I ask you to consider that neither one is right or wrong. They're just different, and there's a different set of motivations and so forth. So let's take a look at history. Here is a recent podcast, early in May, with Tyler Cowen and a fellow from the University of Chicago by the name of Chris Blattman, I believe is how you pronounce it. And he talks about the nature of war and centralized power. And he goes through a pretty elegant categorization of how war happens and some of the triggers and some of the calculus that gets societies and different factions into a warring state. But one of the things he brings up is that centralized leaders that have a diminished level of accountability are more prone to enter into war just by the nature of their power or their force and their the structure of a centralized construct. So again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that this is an academic, pretty well defined and interesting view of centralized power. And that you can see that phenomena happening has happened throughout history over and over again. And I assert that we're seeing it happen in the Ukrainian conflict situation. So let's talk about decentralized military power or the prevalence to prevail. Well, this is not a scientific study by any means, but I've listed a few conflicts that I would assert the decentralized forces have overcome the centralized forces. In the American Revolution, the Revolutionary Army was more decentralized than the British and basically prevailed. Same thing in Vietnam with the Viet Cong. I would say they were more decentralized and basically prevailed. Same in Afghanistan. And now I would assert that we're seeing something similar emerging in the Ukraine. And you'll notice that the decentralized forces were also sort of they were in their own country, that they were where they had another entity that was invading their country, basically. So that's definitely a dynamic to keep in mind. But it's also interesting to me that not only were these forces motivated and for the most part decentralized, but they were able to overcome much, at least on the surface, what would seem to be much more powerful centralized armies and foes, let's say. So we're going to talk about a little bit later some actual conflicts that have occurred in the cyber realm in China, Turkey, Spain, and I ask you to consider that Bitcoin, by its very nature, is constantly under attack and constantly under threat, and yet it still survives in a very decentralized construct. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail as we progress. Here is a talk, again, by Thomas E. Ricks, Pulitzer Prize winning author, Why I Fear We Will Lose Our Next Big War. and he's a national security expert. This first, I can't quite see it, but one of these, and I'm going to show you both. One of them is an abbreviated version, about 7 minutes, that's condensed, and that's a great introduction to Thomas Urich's thought process and the way he frames some of the conflicts that we're currently encountering. And then the next one is, yes, this is the longer version. This is the full talk. It's almost an hour, and I invite you to watch this. But basically, the key point that he makes in this talk is that we generally, as a society, tend to fight the war that we're in today using the techniques from the prior wars that we've experienced in the past. And that can be a big mistake. And I think as we start to look at these decentralized constructs, it becomes pretty clear to me, at least, that all the resources that we've poured into conventional military equipment and ways to fight our conflicts might be it might be time for a rather radical adjustment in this thing that we call decentralization. Web3 and blockchain might be a much more viable way to at least incorporate our defense as well as whatever offense that's necessary for us to pursue. So let's take a look at conflicts. Here's an article, and this talks about how blockchain technology has numerous applications for defense because of the decentralized nature of it. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this particular article, but it talks about how, the federal government is looking at blockchain and decentralization as a way to provide defense in ways that weren't available prior to blockchain emerging on the scene. Here is a short video that summarizes the cyber attacks that have been launched on the Ukrainian region and governments and so forth, and the intensity of those attacks, which actually has taken out power grids, disrupted communications, and so forth. And I'd like to remind everyone that this is not really new for the region. I believe it was 2014, Crimea basically encountered a similar type of conflict. And the point being is that there's been about an 8-year period where this region has been well aware of the potential for the current conflict to arise. And but this particular video goes into some excellent points about how devastating the cyber attacks and can be on infrastructure, society, operations, and how effective they can be launched and devastating they can be. So here's a little map that I made where, right or wrong, I've identified and I've categorized, this is my categorization of these particular entities, but both Estonia as well as the Ukraine, Belarus to some degree, but I didn't study that at much length, or Lithuania or Latvia, but certainly Estonia and the Ukraine have embraced blockchain and decentralized technology and constructs. And specifically for Estonia, as a response to the threat that they fear from their neighbors to the east, Russia. And I've got some material regarding that. So I think it's just interesting to keep the location of these entities in mind as we're going through this look at centralized constructs versus decentralized constructs. And it's not totally the case that Russia is centralized, but in my view, relative to the Western entities, Estonia and Ukraine, certainly the Russian forces seem to be taking a more centralized approach. So here's an article on the Ukraine and how cryptocurrency is playing into their situation, both in terms of fundraising and the ability to maintain an economy and commerce and so forth, even in the disruption of their banking system and societal financial constructs. Here is an article that highlights that the Ukrainian government has been exploring, I believe, since 2017, launching a central bank digital currency using a construct that many of us are adopting here in the desert blockchain community called Stellar. And I think this is really interesting. They actually have picked Stellar, officially picked Stellar as their central bank digital currency to launch and operate. And if you look into Stellar, you'll see things like Stellar Expert, which is one of their main ways to explore and investigate the Stellar blockchain. This happens to be, and I'm not totally sure, but I'm pretty sure that this was built by a set of software developers or a developer that actually is in the Ukraine. And there are a couple of the pieces that are pretty foundational to Stellar that were developed with Ukrainian expertise. And this is the Twitter feed of, I believe, the developer of Stellar Expert, and I think it's Albita. And you can see that the top post there is talking about the Russian army and concern that people have expressed for this particular developer. So here is the Stellar Expert, and you can see it's a fairly complicated and complex dashboard taking information from all over the Stellar network. And then this is the Albita, which is a public-private key management construct, pretty interesting. And here is an article about the Ukrainian central bank digital currency that appears to be operating at some level during this time of conflict. And you can see that the subheadline there, that the Stellar CEO, Daniel Dixon, is talking about how the Ukrainian government is using this particular construct that's based upon Stellar. This is a little video, an interview in Australia, and this lady is with one of the exchanges. And just to summarize what she says, she is saying that she talks about how the Ukrainian people are relying upon cryptocurrency to provide them with a way to maintain at least some of their wealth, some of their value as they are becoming refugees in foreign countries. She also talks about the sanctions and at least her asserted ability as a representative of this exchange to identify cryptocurrency transactions that may or may not comply with the sanctions. So here's kind of an interesting article that's just talking about how the Ukrainian digital battle is not going as we would have expected, because the Russians, prior to this actual real live conflict, most people would have guessed that the Russians would have been able to defeat the Ukrainians both on the battlefield in the kinetic conflict as well as in the digital realm, with the Russians' perceived superiority with cyber warfare. But that isn't the way it's going. And I'm not sure, I can't totally quantify, and I'm not sure anybody can totally quantify how much the Stellar Network is playing into the ability of the Ukrainian people to maintain their financial and communications constructs and so forth. But I think it's well worth noting here. Here's just a Google search, shows some other articles and items that you might be interested in. So this is a more general article talking about the military applications of blockchain technology for the US, China, and Russia. And I won't go into this in much detail, but it is fairly recent, within about a year. But you can see that other people are looking at this realm of exploration and analysis. Here's a very recent report, came out, I think I got it yesterday, and it's talking about distributed denial of service attacks in general, but it has a section here on specifically the Ukrainian conflict and how the DDoS attacks have been ramped up. And yet, again, the Ukrainians seemed to be weathering the intensity of these distributed denial of service attacks. And I'll talk about this a little bit more related to blockchain, but blockchain and decentralization is considered to be a better way to operate in the face of a DDoS attack, because it's difficult, if not impossible, to DDoS a distributed ledger construct. So here's a little more detail and specifics on some of the things that have occurred in the Ukraine. Now, here's an article, fairly recent, little less than a year ago, talking about the pros and cons of blockchain and ransomware and so forth, a different type of attack instead of DDoS ransomware attacks. And yes, ransomware has mostly been fueled by cryptocurrency that seems to give the attackers a shield of cover. But on the other side of the coin, in this same article is this mention, which is that the interplanetary file system is a good way to combat or fend off ransomware attacks. And we'll talk a little bit more about IPFS, the interplanetary file system, in just a bit. But I did want to highlight that particular piece in this particular article. So get back into full screen mode as this is loading. And then here's another article from late last year talking about the increased capability to trace the payments that are associated with ransomware. And I think that's an important development, both for enterprise, public administration, as well as in a conflict or military situation. And then here's another article talking about some more specifics regarding deploying crypto and blockchain in ransomware constructs. Now, to focus in a little bit more on IPFS, this is Juan Benet, who is the founder of Protocol Labs. He founded Protocol Labs in about 2014 or so. Graduate in computer science from Stanford University. And interestingly enough, Juan's professor is one of the architects of Stellar, Professor David Mazeras, and I might be mispronouncing his name, actually was Juan's professor at Stanford. So although IPFS is radically different than Stellar, both of these gentlemen share some common ground, at least from their academics. But in this TED Talk, which I highly recommend you watch, Juan does a great job of talking about the overall societal and economic constructs needs for a decentralized peer-to-peer file storage system and some of the other elements that they're working on. And here's their website. Now, here's the really interesting part that, again, is in a real life combat situation or like combat situation where the government of Turkey basically took down the Turkish Wikipedia page and or information in an attempt to basically censor some of the items that were appearing on the Turkish Wikipedia site. IPFS was able to go in and reconstruct that information in a way that was not susceptible to the Turkish government taking it down. I think that's really, really important. And I think one of the dimensions of this talk that's important to keep in mind is that we're not talking about theoretical constructs here. We're talking about real life, real world, as adversarial as you can get tests of some of these decentralized constructs. So it withstood the conflict from the Turkish state actor of Turkey. It also withstood a similar attack from the government of Spain, which was interested in censoring certain information related to the, I think it's Catalonian uprising that occurred at some point within the last few years. So again, the Spanish government was able to censor certain information on the web, and the folks at Protocol Labs were able to reconstruct that information such that it was not defeated by a state actor or state level attack and censorship effort. The same thing has happened in China. And I think that is very strong, where there have been efforts, as highlighted in these items, where the Chinese government has been interested in withholding certain information or suppressing certain information that they deemed, contrary to their directives and so forth. And the decentralized file system of IPFS seems to have been able to withstand that particular confrontation. And we have all heard about various governments, including China, their attempts to ban some key elements of the decentralized realm, like crypto trading and mining and so forth. And it's it's a question as to how successful those initiatives have been. So let's talk about the bright side. Let's talk about peace. So we've talked about the conflict and so forth, and decentralization versus centralization in conflict realms. Let's talk about it in the peace realm. This is one of my favorite talks and videos of all time. It's less than 3 minutes. This is Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winning economist from the University of Chicago. And this is not, I believe this was written by someone else, but Milton Friedman does a great job of talking about a pencil. And the title of the talk is I Pencil. And basically what he's saying is that there is no one person on the face of the earth that can create the pencil that he's holding in his hand. The creation of that pencil is an effort that's the summation of tens of thousands of people doing everything from chopping down trees to mining the metal to growing rubber plants, all of these things that come together in a, these are Jay's words, I would say a miraculous set of events that is very much decentralized and driven by signals in the marketplace. So I won't gush on anymore about Professor Friedman's talk and the elegance of this particular item. But the one thing I would ask you to consider at the end is he talks about how this marvelous mechanism of the market actually results in peace and results in people trading with one another that outside of the context of the market would actually be possibly mortal enemies. So I think this very short talk does an excellent example of showing how these decentralized sort of positive incentive-based constructs can be miraculous at ushering in eras of peace. And just to highlight that point, this is another famous economist, Friedrich Bastiat, I believe is how you pronounce his name, from the 1800s. And it's not really certain if he came up with this phrase or not, but everybody agrees that it pretty well reflects his thoughts and sentiments. But he said, supposedly, or is given to have said, that when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. And I think that's really, really important in the context of peace, and that when things like decentralization, the ability to send value at just as we send an email anywhere in the world with as little friction as possible, at least in my view, this is one of the best hopes that we have for long periods of peace. So let's talk a little bit about Web3. Here's a little bit on Belarus and some of their blockchain initiatives. Won't go into that. This is a really interesting report, a general report on what Estonia has done to embrace decentralization, blockchain technology and constructs to apply to as much of their public administration and their society and their ecosystems as possible. Again, and I interpret this as a signal that they view decentralization as one of their best defenses and strengths as a government, as a society, as a culture. And here is an article also highlighting that one of their main motivations is to position Estonia, which is a much smaller country, as a viable state to maintain their sovereignty in the face of whatever adversity they might encounter. So that's pretty much it for, we can kind of take questions, topics, and so forth away from the screen share. That's a little bit about me, and that's pretty much it. And feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions or comments. So I will take it off of screen share. So Charles, what do you think? Any comments, any questions about all that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's there's a lot in there. And I think, as you kind of mentioned in the beginning, as you're going through that, really seeing that objective or object relating to the world as objects versus relationships really comes through. And actually, the one of the later points you were talking about with Friedman and the pencil, it made me think about the increased demand that was generated by the invention of the printing press, and paper really wasn't widely available, at least not in the Western world. I believe the Chinese had started using around the 6th century, but the demand for paper actually wound up creating a lot of work that went into making it more available, and by increasing the ability for people to use that in designing and relating to the world, we saw a lot of great manuscripts and works, and really the foundation of the Renaissance was built on people being able to dream with paper. So it's amazing how that same kind of philosophy applies, and how it really does pop up in different corners of our history, right?
Thanks, Charles. I think that's a great point, because I have looked at blockchain and decentralization and Web3 as in a framework and a lens very similar to that it's actually enhancing our ability to engage in free speech and free communications and free interaction that's driven by choice, that's driven by an entire universe of worldviews, that each one of us has a different worldview. You have a different worldview than I do. And that's another dimension of not only free speech and the ability to be with free speech and to hear another person's maybe 180-degree different worldview, but it's hard to treat somebody as an object if you're able to actually hear their worldview without getting upset or fearful or combative about it, and just say, okay, well, Jay has a different worldview than I do. And that is one of the really rich parts of interacting with one another from the context of relatedness versus objects. So thanks for bringing that up. And that is a subtle but profound dimension of the pencil being an instrument that facilitates language, expression, and speech. So what else did you see, Charles?
Yeah, I personally, I think one of the things that drew me to the blockchain world, the crypto world, was the decentralized nature of it. I know that I guess one of the things that I think we really need to be talking about as a larger society as these technologies take hold, and governments and national currencies start to look at adopting CBDCs, is safeguards to ensure that we are protecting that free speech. I say that, as an American, I say that from that perspective, growing up in that kind of ability to voice my opinion I know that it's not necessarily the case everywhere in the world. And I think one of the ways that we voice our opinion is the way we spend and allocate our resources. And I think we're seeing that with cryptocurrency. We see that obviously with the current fiat currency and that kind of thing. But I think one of the biggest things that is going under the radar right now, and I think it relates to a lot of what you're saying, is, you know, a CBDC is not just a digital dollar. It is the ability, if one so chooses, to apply behavioral psychology from a centralized point onto currency. So that meaning, you know, you have to be very careful about how these things are implemented, because if you have restrictions on certain companies, on certain people, on people that express certain opinions, you can see, unfortunately, the weaponization of currency. And I think that isn't to say that that is necessarily what is going to happen. But I mean, we have certainly already seen with the digital yuan adoption that behavioral incentives can absolutely apply to CBDCs. And I think as I'm going through the presentation, it's one of the things that really comes up in my mind. It is applying centralized theory to, you know, the space, and I think it really it deserves some immense amount of thought as it's being rolled out and adopted. And hesitation.
Charles, that's a great point, and I would like to emphasize something that, you know, I have often heard since I first started exploring blockchain. Many people say blockchain is just a database. And the point that you're bringing up, Charles, I think is a key point. There's a dimension or multiple dimensions to blockchain and decentralization and distributed ledger technologies that is different than a database. In a database, in an Oracle database, or, you know, whatever, MongoDB database, you don't have a component that's doing price signaling. You don't have this incentivization or disincentivization that's fundamental to the zeros and ones. And that's a really subtle point, but it's a really, really powerful point that's always at play just to keep the system together, is that financial component that's both where people are, and some people might disagree with me on this, but you're actually voting with every single transaction. And it's a vote that's taking in price signals from almost the entire universe of the construct that you're dealing in. So, you know, whether it's you're dealing in Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, there is a collective, cohesive signaling and construct that is part of the zeros and ones that I assert is radically different than a MongoDB database just sitting in a box running on a, you know, server or whatever. So that's a great point on the central bank digital currencies and the you know, the care that we should call upon ourselves and others to institute regarding the policy and the elements of central bank digital currencies, I think is really, really important. So any other thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I think just be very curious to see how the conversation continues to go. I think it really changes in my mind. It's one of the reasons that I personally invest in something like Bitcoin, is because I to me, it's redefined what inherent value means. I find that I believe there is a very distinct possibility that Bitcoin is encapsulating an inherent value, that is to say privacy and free speech in a way that currency has not done previously. Time will tell, but I think at the very least, I think those kind of in the sphere are aware of that idea and concept and are seeing kind of where that goes. I'd love to see somebody like Elon Musk bring attention to it, like he did with kind of AI, getting that conversation going, or just somebody that can kind of bridge that gap between the people that are maybe living a little bit closer to the rails on it, and the larger world. I don't think that could hurt.
Well, interesting that you bring up 2 points that I'd like to follow up on. Number one is, I don't follow Elon Musk a lot, but I am seeing him talking about these digital constructs, cryptocurrency and blockchain and so forth. From my casual observation, it looks like it's occupying a lot of his thought process and attention these days. And I think that says something about the power of these constructs, and how someone with his level of innovation and entrepreneurial activity, and I can't imagine the time demands that he has, but for him to be paying as much attention as he seems to be paying, and his I would, in my view, commitment to free speech and his acquisition of Twitter, I think that says a lot about these particular constructs. Now, the second thing is that I believe the Stellar Foundation just released, either today or within the last few days, a white paper on how the Stellar blockchain and ecosystem is designed to be a central bank digital currency construct. So I didn't include that in the presentation, but I think if you're interested in that area, the central bank digital currency application that's associated, or possible use case that's associated with Stellar, is basically one of the primary applications. So I'm gonna kind of cut it off and do another screen share and talk about some events coming up that I would like to highlight, bring to people's attention. So let's see. So the first one is in August, and it is the DWeb camp in the Mendocino area, about 2.5 hours north of San Francisco. And that will be August 24th through the 28th. It's estimated it'll be about 500 to 700 people gathering in a camp-like setting. I was at the one in 2019, about an hour south of San Francisco. It was about 400 people, 500, and it was an amazing event. But I highly recommend that you take a look and see some of the people that are participating. I consider this to be some of the most creative and committed people in the decentralized realm, that are, actually standing up elements that are what I consider to be a path for the future of many of our societal constructs. So that's one thing. And then immediately following, on the 29th of August, is the Science of Blockchain conference at Stanford University. And if you're into math and you're into the most esoteric topics you can imagine, this is your event. and they have reinstituted the registration process for this. But if you take a look at the people that are involved in this, it's an amazing gathering. I've also attended this several years in the past, and each time it's an eye-opening and inspirational event. So that is basically it. Our next events will be the second Saturday of excuse me, June, and that will be an open house at Desert Blockchain Camp, and then the fourth Wednesday of June will be our next monthly. So thank you for your time and attention and comments, Charles, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Me too. Thanks, Jay.
Bye.